I think the main ones are sin stocks. So I don't invest in weapons companies. I don't invest in fossil fuels. I don't invest in gambling companies. Climate change. It's a big reason why I invest in these areas because the change is so inevitable that if you know it's going to happen, it makes you feel pretty at ease when you're holding a stock that's maybe drawn down a little bit. BYD is by far the biggest EV company in the world, bigger than Tesla, which most people don't realize. The thing that's really going to be the big game changer for people is when we move to what I mentioned earlier, which was having your car act as a battery for your house and for everything else so that you can sell the power from your car back to the grid when it needs it in the middle of the day, potentially while you're at work.
Hello and welcome to the Achieving Alpha podcast. My name is Stephen and I am the host of the show. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jay Smith. He is an elite pro popular investor on eToro and he is managing up to $60 million AUM for 15,000 people worldwide. He is an ethical investor, and one of the key themes of his portfolio is electrification and sustainability. And it is that what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to the podcast, Jay. How are you?
I'm great. I'm having a great time, apart from the weather, but yeah, it's good.
Yes, yes. And today we're going to be talking about electrification. And I know that you've had your own electrification issues today in your house. So I think it's a very good topic for us to talk about and very fitting.
Yeah, luckily not an electric shock or anything that electrifying.
No, no, just some electrician work.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, it's really great to have you on the show today. What I'm trying to achieve from today's show is to talk as much as we can about electrification, as I know it's one of the key themes of your portfolio. And we'll also be talking a bit about sustainability and more about renewable energy sources, as well as talking about ethical investing. So it's really great to have someone like you on the podcast, someone who has real world examples, not just investing examples of what's happening out there in this world. Okay, Jay, as it's your first time on the podcast, is it possible if you could give us a background into your life growing up, how you got into investing, and just where you are today?
Yeah. So I'm from the UK. My background in terms of growing up was pretty normal, relatively average family, middle class, south of England. Nothing really all that exciting. By the time I was about 12 or 13, I started to get interested in finance and investing and business and quite a few kind of anything that was an ecosystem really I was interested in. I was interested in things from railway systems to electrical systems, anything like that. Just a bit of a nerd. I liked understanding how things worked. So financial markets was one of those things. So when I was about 13 or so, I started pestering my parents if I could open a trading account because there was an age limit. They said no. Eventually, when I was 18, I opened one that was joint with my mum because I didn't have much money. It was all very complex for me at the time. I had no idea what I was doing. And so I self taught myself investing for the first few years. Fast forward a bit, and in 2017, I quit my full time job to move into investing full time. Prior to that, I was working in the gaming industry. So I was a professional gamer for a long time. Back when it didn't pay the big bucks, I was playing games and just about scraping a living for a bit, and then I moved to working on the event side of esports. So I hosted major esports tournaments around Europe and big LAN events and publisher events, all that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's always great to hear everybody's story about how they got into investing. Often it's the very small things that give you the thought that, oh, look, I want to go into investing and it would be something that I enjoy.
But for me, I think it was just understanding the financial system and the realization of how compound interest works. I think that was the moment where my brain switched over and was like, okay, I need to do this.
Cool. All right. And I know that you're very into ethical investing. What is the origin of that? When did you start to think, okay, it's very important that I invest not only to make a profit, but also I do it in order to be as ethical as I can in line with my moral code, etc.? What made you become an ethical investor?
Yeah, it's a good question, really. I don't really know at what point it kind of switched over for me. I think, again, from a reasonably young age, I was quite interested in climate change and the environment. And the more I learned about it, the more I kind of realized that we have to do something to try and limit it, and that the world wasn't really kind of moving fast enough. So some of that obviously started with the usual kind of personal responsibility, right? Recycling, etc. But it didn't take too long before I started looking at the companies I was investing in and thinking, are these guys actually good for how sustainable is this business? And I think that's a kind of key word actually in terms of my ethics. Really, a lot of it comes from sustainability. Um, you know, is this a business that can continue into the future, or is it doomed to die because it runs out of resources or because it's made redundant, something like that? Are there risks involved with it from that side of things? But yeah, I think really it was environmentalism, to kind of spin back to where the question started. Environmentalism is the thing that kind of drove me towards that, and then it just expanded a bit from there, really.
Awesome. So, what are your limitations then in terms of what don't you invest in?
So I think the main ones are the kind of sin stocks. So I don't invest in weapons companies. I don't invest in fossil fuels. I don't invest in gambling companies. Those really are the kind of the main three. But then beyond that, I would say it's very hard to draw boxes around exactly what you want in terms of ethical investing. But generally, I try to avoid companies that I kind of deem to be bad for society. So that can be a bit of a blurry line sometimes, because you can look at a company like Amazon, for example, and say, well, they're displacing small businesses and they're maybe not treating their staff the best. But then at the same time, they're also responsible for some big kind of progress in terms of logistics and making that more efficient around the world. So there's pros and cons to a lot of these businesses, and drawing the line is always incredibly difficult, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very difficult to know where that line stops, and I think it comes down to everybody's own ethics and what they stand for and what they think is their limit, because there are, second and third degree impacts potentially on things that you wouldn't invest in. So I just give an example that I'm just thinking in my head is like automobile companies, right? They are doing electric cars, but a lot of them are still making big profits from gasoline cars, right? So it's just where does the line be drawn? But I think that's down to everybody's own personal ethics.
Yeah, I think a good point related to that actually is that there's kind of this debate in the kind of impacting investing, responsible investing space about, is it a good thing to do to invest in a fossil fuel company as a green investor, because then you have more influence to try and sway them away from fossil fuels and towards transitioning to a more sustainable business model. So that's kind of like a fierce area of competition. Personally, I tend to stick more to the side of invest in the companies that have already made that decision. I mean, a good example, I'm sure we'll probably touch on wind power later, but Ørsted is a company that used to do all sorts of things in the oil industry and is now completely in the wind industry. They completely pivoted their entire business I think it was over a decade ago now, maybe even 2 decades. So, it's possible to do it. It's just deciding on if you want to fight that battle or not. And I think if you're a smaller investor, that's very difficult because you don't have a voice as such. Really, you get to vote on things, and maybe you can make a shareholder proposal, but that's about as much impact as you can really have.
Yeah, I think even oil companies will eventually move over to core businesses in sustainability, sustainable energy. But as you're saying, right now they're making the majority of their profits from fossil fuels. So, yeah, that would be a decision when it comes to it. Okay, and have you ever had any restrictions on in terms of your investing in on your portfolio? So obviously, you've got some limitations on things that you can't invest in. How does that generally affect your performance? And do you think that people have to bear that in mind that it's an ethical portfolio? and that you might not have all of the necessary assets to choose from when investing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, there's quite a bit of debate on this. There's some evidence to suggest that you can perform just as well when you're ethically investing, and some evidence to suggest that you can't. I tend to go on the side of caution and warn my copiers and investors that realistically, I think there is always going to be some limitation. For example, I think the energy industry is a good example. Trying to find good ethical companies in that space that meet the criteria that I have is much more difficult than in a different space like the tech industry, where most of those companies have got lots of pledges on sustainability. So it does make it much more difficult. Mining is another good example. Trying to find mining companies that aren't, endlessly going to be kind of, destroying parts of the planet and things, and are doing things in a clean way and putting things back how they should be after they're finished mining. It's another area that's very, very difficult to try and find something ethical, depending on what your standards are. So yeah, there's definitely limitations on it. In terms of how it impacts performance, as I said, I think I like to warn people that it can and that there is likely to be a trade-off. But I also think that it's entirely possible to beat the benchmarks whilst investing ethically. And I think if you look around at some of the big kind of growth names that have done well over the past 5, 10 years in markets, you can see that a lot of those companies are actually very sustainable and ethical companies.
Yeah, and there are some investors that are just, say, invested in a specific field that might not have any ethical considerations, and they have the same restrictions as well, right? So, yeah, that makes sense. All right. And if we talk about sustainable energy now, so I was looking and it said that by 2050, I think it is, the plan is to make it 70% must be from renewable sources of energy. I understand at the moment we're at about 30. Is that correct?
It's somewhere around that region, yeah. It depends. It varies obviously country by country, but
Okay. How do you think that it will kind of play out? Can you see it that it will move over slowly? So kind of a more gradual process where that becomes 30, 35, over to 40, etc. Or do you think it might um, start off quite slowly and then have like a rapid take up in adoption later on as things progresses? How do you think that will play out?
so I think it's interesting. I mean, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, in 2010, they gave out a forecast that solar energy would reach 5% of the global energy needs by 2030. In 2023, it was 5.6% already. So solar massively outperformed what they expected and is still, on a massive growth trajectory. I think the problem is that we're already taking the easy wins. It's very easy to install solar in countries that have lots of sun, right? um, but if you are living somewhere that doesn't have much sun, suddenly that's a bit more difficult. The same goes out with wind. Even nuclear, there are restrictions on how accessible are the materials that you need, how long does it take to build. People complain about China's emissions a lot because obviously they use a lot of coal. They also build more nuclear than pretty much anyone else in the world and more solar than anyone else in the world. In fact, they deployed more solar last year than every other country in the world combined. And I think it's similar for wind there as well. So I think it's a case of it's going to be quite rapid, and I think we're kind of in that sort of the early innings of the really rapid period of growth where maybe it can go from 30% up to 60% quite quickly. But then the further up you go, the more difficult it will become because you're left with the areas that are difficult to fix, where there is no sun and there is no wind. If you're in northern Alaska, what are you really going to try and where are you going to get that power from? Especially if it's very distributed, something like nuclear is not necessarily great because it's so spread out. So I think that's the thing. We're going to see it continue to accelerate, but then I think it starts getting difficult the further in you get.
Yeah. You mentioned there about geographical diversity and how the take up is very different in different countries, for example. You mentioned a lot of it was to do with weather. Do you think some of it as well has to do with economic issues, the cost of installation, the education around sustainable energy in some of these second and third world countries?
Yeah, I think obviously there's also a lot of kind of political tie-ins there as well. You know, if a country is very well aligned with China, then I would say they're more likely to end up getting nuclear or going down the route of solar because they have less restrictions. I think, and geothermal is another interesting one as well. Actually, geothermal, especially in areas of kind of Central America, kind of South America region, is growing quite rapidly. So I think there is potential there. Really, I think a lot of it in those countries, in terms of the slower rollout, comes down to the poor infrastructure. They haven't really kind of built up their energy infrastructure well enough, just generally, to support it. Sometimes that can actually play in their favor, though. So in a lot of countries in Africa, like Tanzania, that kind of region, Mozambique, those countries didn't have that infrastructure either. They didn't have a big grid that was covering the entire country when they started, but because they had good access to sun, they could just build localized solar and have it locally serving one village at a time, and that was very beneficial for them. So yeah, it's really kind of a big mix everywhere around the world. Really, there's challenges for every region. Some of them political, some of them geographical, some of them financial as well.
Yeah, I know that in Scandinavia, there's a big uptake of both solar and electric cars, actually, in that area of the world, Sweden and Norway and countries like that. What do you think is the most important when it comes to getting more adoption of solar energy and sustainable energy? Do you think it's more to do with governments and them providing incentives for people to use solar power, for example, or electric cars? Or do you think it's more to do with education around the people? Or what do you think are the main factors?
Okay, so I think for electric vehicles, if we kind of start there, I think subsidies for electric vehicles helps to solve the problem of people switching to renewables. Because once you have an electric vehicle, and assuming that you own your own home, which obviously not everyone does, but assuming that you do, it very quickly you realize that it makes sense for you to get solar panels on your roof, and then you can charge your car at home. The other thing that I think is a big kind of potential big influence on people both investing in solar and in electric vehicles is when we start to see more cars with vehicle to grid systems. So a car that can essentially act as a battery for the grid. So you can charge it up, and then you can use your car to power your house through the night if you wanted to as well. So that way, you are essentially providing a service to the grid overall. You are able to take electricity when there's too much of it, plenty of it in the grid, and then you can sell it back to the grid when the grid needs it and kind of deplete your battery again. So I think that's a technology that is definitely going to play a big role in terms of the uptake. In terms of the kind of some of the subsidies side of things, in the US, the UK, the US had, certainly in California, they had the net energy metering system, which essentially was a kind of guaranteed rate that you could export your electricity at from your solar. What happened is that so many people ended up adopting solar in California that they ended up with what's called a duck curve. So it's kind of like an inverted bell curve, and it's for the time of day across the bottom axis and the amount of power demand across the top axis. So what that's really showing is that as you approach the middle of the day, there is the price of electricity goes negative in California. And that's because they had guaranteed this rate for exporting. So everyone was exporting it and not using the power. And they got to a point where there's no one willing to use it across the entirety of California. They exported some. And so now we've moved into a situation where they updated the rules and changed that system to change that rate probably about 5 or 6 years ago, and then they did it again last year. So now we're in a situation where actually you can end up paying to export your power. So what that's doing is forcing people to change how they're consuming the power and making it so that people are turning more things on during the middle of the day to use that power and trying to shift the curve of how power is used throughout a day. So yeah, those incentives work, but then they have to be updated because of these kind of effects. And we're seeing that same duck curve in all sorts of countries around the world now. Pretty much everywhere is developing that same curve now because of solar power specifically, where during the day, it's just not worth exporting it because it's not worth anything. It's too plentiful.
Yeah. Well, I think cost effectiveness, I think not only should it be good for the environment, but it also should be very cost effective, right? There should be incentives for people to put it into their house, to use it for industrial purposes or whatever they might be using it for, because it's better energy and it is also more cost effective. I notice now we only have about 3%, I think, of residential houses worldwide have solar panels and solar power inside their houses. First of all, why do you think the take up has been so slow and the rollout has been so slow of houses getting solar power? And also, maybe you can regale your story about how you have installed solar panels inside your house.
Yeah. Well, I think actually it ties the two things together quite nicely. So at my previous property, I installed solar panels and it was no problem. It was a relatively small roof, so the number of panels being installed was, nothing too crazy. And in the UK, you can get up to 3.5 kilowatts of solar installed relatively easily. They almost always just say yes to it when you ask the grid, basically, your DNO. If you have more than that, things start to get a bit tricky. And it's the same actually, even with small solar farms as well, where the problem isn't so much getting permission to do it from the standpoint of would it be useful, should it be connected, is there planning permission, all of those things. Those aren't the issue. The issue is the grid is not designed in those areas to take that excess power when it gets exported. So if you disconnect yourself entirely from the grid, they'd let you build solar anywhere, pretty much. Certainly in the UK, there would really be no objections to it. But because you are connected to the grid and that grid needs to send that energy somewhere, and all of your neighbors potentially have also put panels on their houses, suddenly the infrastructure that was put in place when they first built that kind of a suburb is no longer fit for purpose. And so they have to pay to upgrade that. And that's exactly what happened with my solar panels. I ended up paying for them to come out and dig up the road to lay new cables, three-phase cables to my house, because I foolishly decided that I wanted 26 solar panels, which is so I am plastered and I'm powering most of my neighborhood, which is a good thing, but that obviously made it very cost ineffective. The other big hurdle besides getting permission from DNOs because of the amount of power you're exporting, the other big issue besides that is the capital at the end of the day. It does cost money to do it, and it does take 5 to 10 years depending on your setup to earn that money back. For commercial use cases, commercial applications, that's much, much closer to the 5 year timeline, sometimes even less. But there, the problem again is the infrastructure, because if you have to export some of that power, then you're basically waiting for the grid infrastructure to be able to support it. And that can take years.
So, Jay, you mentioned 5 years, right? If you had a property today, a regular sized house, and you installed a sensible amount of solar panels in your house to power your house, you mentioned it would take probably 5 years to pay that back. What do you think is the sweet spot in order to get uh, more people on board? Do you think people would be willing to pay 2 or 3 years before they get their investment back? I don't know. What's your thoughts on it as someone who's interested in this field?
So I think it's like any other form of investment, really. If you look at it and you compare it to, how would your money perform if it was in a bank? How would your money perform if it was in stocks and shares? How would your money perform if it was in solar panels? So really, it comes down to that. People are looking for that return on investment. Now, obviously, after 6 or 7 years, you should start moving into profit, and that should then grow exponentially from that point. And it's quite safe, really. It's quite a safe investment. But I think the problem is that there's also the kind of insecurity about will people be living in their house for long enough, to benefit from that. And then when you add on top of that all of the different complications that kind of arise from getting permission from the local grid operators and everything else, then suddenly it becomes a slightly less appealing option. I think the other thing is that, like any kind of work that you get done on your house, you never really know necessarily the quality of workmanship. You don't know what you're paying for. Solar is complicated. So for the average person to make sure that they're getting a good deal can be a bit more difficult. It's a very kind of fragmented industry in terms of the installation side of things. So there's no big reputable name that you can go to that's always going to be the same quality everywhere. So that's another challenge, I think.
Yeah. I guess the issue is in places like the UK, the houses are so old, right? And some of them are, at least 50 years old. Some of them are 100, years old. Um, so in order to be able to do it, you have to install everything yourself. And then that takes investment. As you said, you're not sure how long you're going to live there either, and whether it's going to add any value to your house at all if you were to sell it. I guess it makes more sense to install it in new build houses or have it directly in the roof. I know that I think Tesla dabbled with that for a while, right? I'm not sure if that's a solution, but it would take a lot of time for that new inventory to get into the system as new houses.
Yeah, we don't tend to refresh our entire housing stock too frequently. So
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, and I guess the economics of industrial solar is very different because a lot of these are specific projects that are being built for this use case. Do you see a lot of development in terms of the industrial solar industry? And where do you think we go from here?
yeah, so I think the commercial side of solar and the much larger kind of applications it's fared up a lot better in the last few years as well, where interest rates have gone up. The margins there and the amount of time it takes to turn a profit is much lower than rooftop solar simply because of the scale. So that industry has been a bit more robust. I think the challenge that industry is now starting to face, certainly in most Western countries, is that there is now kind of a backlash about the amount of space that it takes up. Because people are just installing it in fields and things like that. There's a lot more backlash against it. It's not so bad in countries like Morocco, which has got vast areas of desert that they're installing their installations into. There, it's obviously not causing such a big issue, but the problem with that is that then you've got to transport that power to where it's needed. And I think that's kind of ties in with one of the other potential problems with the commercial side of things as well, is that as these facilities get bigger and bigger, the amount of infrastructure required to transport that power to where it's actually used is more and more. And so then you end up kind of eating away at the savings that you made by installing this big solar farm because you have to pay for it to get transported everywhere. And that's a lot more expensive to do in some regions.
Yeah, yeah, can imagine that can be expensive in certain regions. Okay, so which solar companies do you like? Which solar companies do you have in your portfolio? And what are some of the drivers and some of the challenges that they face?
Okay, well, there's two kind of main positions in my portfolio with solar exposure, which is SolarEdge and Enphase. Both of those companies are focused on building inverters rather than solar panels. And the reason that I like both of those companies is that between them, they kind of have a duopoly on what I would call the smart inverter. So essentially, a system that is able to kind of regulate your solar panels and maximize their performance. Because generally, if you have a string of solar panels all connected together, whichever solar panel is the weakest is becomes the bottleneck for the output of all of the other solar panels connected. Enphase and SolarEdge both came up with independent solutions that solve that problem, so that if one panel is defective or breaks, the rest of the panels are still performing at the highest level that they can be. So it's much more efficient. So I like both of those companies because of that. They both have strong kind of patents around it. And also, it's agnostic to the rest of the setup. It doesn't matter which panels are being installed. People will generally, especially for residential, use either Enphase or Solar Edge to invert that power and get it into something usable that they can use in their house. So those are kind of the two big positions. The other position I have is First Solar, which sits much more on that kind of commercial side of things. They do much bigger projects. They work on the design side, so they will design solar farms and big projects and work with big house builders, for example, to design the solar that would go onto all of the houses in a new housing project. So they work on that side of things, and then they also have the solar panel side of the business as well. So and consultancy and other things around it. So they're very different to the first two. In terms of the challenges that they face, I think interest rates is obviously the big one at the moment. Fundamentally, the margins for getting solar installed have come down because interest rates are so high and the cost of capital is so high. And especially for commercial, it's a very capital intensive thing. You need a lot of money to do this. You need to get the land or rights to use the land. The connection to the grid is very expensive for transporting the power. And then obviously the actual materials themselves as well. So capital is a really big problem with high interest rates. The other thing I would say is increasingly relating back to the grid infrastructure again because of the growth that we've seen in AI, which is really drawing a lot of power in certain regions, the people who are operating grids in these different countries are pretty much just backed up for 2, 3, 4 years. So if you propose a new solar farm in the UK or in certain parts of America or Canada or Iceland or a lot of these kind of countries that have big AI and data center exposure, you will find that it's a 3 or 4 year wait before you get your solar farm connected. And that's because they're too busy connecting all of these new data centers and trying to build the infrastructure up around those. So, yeah, there's a bit of a backlog, and that is a big problem for kind of the large scale stuff.
Wow, that's very prohibitive. If you have to wait several years to get a permit to build your project or whatever, that's the difference between you going ahead with the project or not going ahead with the project in many cases, I'm sure. Okay, and I know that Chinese tariffs specifically were a bit of a problem in the industry. Not sure what the latest is on that, but do you see tariffs being a big problem for this solar industry? I guess it's better for the American companies, right? Because they don't have cheap Chinese panels coming in and flooding the market with a lot cheaper rates.
Yeah, and the same is true for electric vehicles as well, actually, on that topic. So, I mean, in the US, I think it's First Solar are building a new facility at the moment in Minnesota, I think, for solar production. But realistically, beyond China, there are not very many solar panels that are produced anywhere else in the world. South Korea has got a few; they've got quite a bit of exposure, um, and maybe I think there's a bit in Japan as well, Taiwan, obviously. But generally speaking, the world is still very much reliant on China for solar panels. So as much as the tariffs, present a hurdle, I think that hurdle has kind of been absorbed by everyone because it's a necessity, right? You can't get your panels anywhere else at the moment. Obviously, the to some extent, the point of these tariffs is to try and lure companies to build those facilities in their own countries and onshore some of that production as we're seeing the same as we're seeing in the semiconductor industry as well, with Intel investing heavily in building in the US as well. But yeah, I think it's a risk from the kind of geopolitical aspect. That's what I would say. It's a risk in terms of what happens with China and Taiwan. What happens if relationships kind of break down further? Then that could be very tricky for the industry to deal with.
Yeah. But I suppose it's better than everything being made in China. At least they've got some incentives now for their operations to operate in the US and Canada and in other countries as well. Otherwise, if there was a geopolitical issue, you might have a bigger issue like you have in the semiconductor industry being mostly made in Taiwan, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably part of what they're acutely aware of when they're putting these tariffs in is the risk that it all ends up in a country that later on they start to worry about.
Yeah. All right. All right, that's a good summary of solar power and sustainability. If we talk more about electric cars and electric vehicles in general, I think, again, on a stat, I think we're about 25% of new cars sold, I think last year, were either electric cars or hybrid type cars. So good progress, but I think there's still some work to do for them to be more mass adopted around the world. Um, do you see all cars in the future being electric power over the years? Or do you think that there could still be kind of a niche of people who like the gasoline cars, or maybe like a bit like we have classic cars? Do you think there might be people keeping some certain amount of gasoline cars?
Yeah, so I think obviously again this is going to depend on the country that you're looking at. I think certainly in Europe the adoption for electric cars is much much faster than what we're seeing over in the US, and some of that comes down to average travel distances and things as well. But generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, I would say that it's very likely we will see pretty much all cars that are able to be sold, except maybe for some kind of track cars and things like that. And as you said, classic cars being electric in the future. So to me, it seems like a pretty inevitable trend. It's a bit like climate change. It's a big reason why I invest in these areas because the change is so inevitable that if you know it's going to happen, it makes you feel pretty at ease when you're holding a stock that's maybe drawn down a little bit in its performance. Um, I think for electric vehicles, it's interesting when you look at countries like Sweden and Norway, where they kind of push their incentives a bit harder, that they're sitting at something like 90% of EV sales last year for Norway, I think, were electric, which is really kind of staggering. And of course, people will throw out arguments like, how do they perform in cold weather? And it's quite easy to to dismiss those when Norway is the country that's adopting them the most of them. So that's good. I think the other interesting thing, just kind of on this subject, is hydrogen as well. People talked a lot about hydrogen early on as a potential competitor with cars. I don't see that at all. I don't think they're even going to compete very much in rail that much. Most railways are becoming electrified now around the world, but there are some hydrogen routes that are good for long distance stuff, like coal trains in the middle of Australia potentially might use hydrogen. And then I guess the last thing is looking at trucking and then aviation and shipping as well. So for trucking, it's a bit more difficult with electric vehicles. Tesla, of course, announced the truck, not the Cybertruck. The Semi, I think they called it, the Tesla Semi, and adoption of it was, very, very, very small. And really, you don't ever see or hear anything about it. And the reason for that is that batteries are heavy, and if you need to add more weight to that because you're transporting something, suddenly the economics of the amount of power you're getting out of this heavy vehicle just trying to propel itself is, it's just not worth it. So there is room for hydrogen to do well there, and hydrogen and electric are both doing surprisingly well in the mining industry as well. Really, really big kind of huge trucks. Both hydrogen and electric have been used there quite well because they don't need the range as much. They just need the brute kind of force. So it's an interesting mix. The last two things for aviation, there's been experiments with putting batteries for planes. That's really difficult because again of the weight. It's very difficult when batteries weigh that much, and especially when you're doing transatlantic flights. The idea of doing that with batteries seems pretty implausible. So hydrogen looks like the best option there, but of course there's a lot of fear around the big airships that used to use use those kind of gases. So I think people are still a bit nervous around it on that side of things. And then for shipping, I think hydrogen looks like probably the best solution. That out there at the moment. Although there are quite a lot of battery operated ferries and things for short haul distances, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. So I think a lot of it comes back to whether something requires a long battery life in order to take them from A to B. So things that involve a really long distance, you're probably going to more likely to look at something like hydrogen rather than look at batteries. What do you think of the battery? innovation that's happening at the moment, do you think that the electric cars have enough battery life in order for them to get mass adoption in the future? Or do you think there's still got to be quite a lot of developments in furthering battery life in order for it to take that up?
Yeah, so I think we're actually at a pretty good spot now. There are quite a few different EVs on the market now that have range approaching 400 miles, some that are even at 500, which is, more than enough. If you can drive 500 miles without stopping to have some food, I would be quite impressed. So, yeah, I think in terms of the range side of things are looking pretty good now. Really, I think the focus is more around the charging speed and the kind of efficiency of the battery and the longevity of the battery and trying to improve that lifespan and maybe look at reducing the weight as well in terms of for cars, that is. Of course, the industry is still pushing in the direction of improving it because there is always the prize of the kind of trucking side of things if things continue to improve as well. And the benefits for rail infrastructure as well could be substantial. There, you can get locomotives that are just full of batteries for a train to use for when it's not on electrified parts of the railway infrastructure, which is really interesting product.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember one of the big issues that they were facing. I remember Elon Musk was talking about it, is about the supply of lithium that's required to mass produce these batteries. Um, I think that's going to be pretty important going forward. Do you think that's something that can be navigated?
So yeah, I think it's just a fascinating space to watch because there are so many new technologies being worked on, the various different forms of solid state batteries that are being worked on, even just reducing weight of batteries or changing batteries that aren't so flammable, for example, as well, can also be very important. We see a lot of that for batteries that are being installed in people's houses because they don't want something that's potentially going to set fire and spontaneously combust while they're asleep. Not that that happens often, but there's kind of innovation in every direction at the moment in the battery industry.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember one of the big issues that they were facing. I remember Elon Musk was talking about it, is about the supply of lithium that's required to mass produce these batteries. Um, I think that's going to be pretty important going forward. Do you think that's something that can be navigated?
Yeah, I mean, there are other battery technologies out there as well. So I think that there's potential there. The other thing is, I think there's two things you need to look at, right? The impact in terms of the mining of it, and how much space that takes up and how big the mines are and the pollution and everything surrounding that. And when you compare that to other resources like coal, for example, it's completely negligible. It's minute in comparison, or even copper or anything like that. So I think on the mining side of things, the debate is kind of over. Really, the problem is the cost of extracting it at this point because we're seeing more and more kind of projects now where people are looking at mining it from the seafloor, for example, which is obviously much more expensive. It's akin to what happened with the oil, where first they were extracting it on land, and then suddenly it was offshore, and they get more and more expensive as time goes on.
Deep water. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there is enough there for what we need. The real question will be about recycling batteries afterwards. I think that's where the challenge will come because once those batteries have kind of gone through their lifespan, we have a relatively toxic kind of thing to get rid of or try and repurpose. And at the moment, batteries are something around 80% recyclable, and it's in terms of getting out what you put in. So trying to get that closer to 95 or 100% is really the goal. And there are some big companies working on that, but none of them really are public. So it's a difficult field to invest in, I would say.
I'm not sure. Have you seen those videos from China? I saw them on YouTube or TikTok or something the other day, where people were there, instead of charging their batteries, they were just going to a certain place in China and they were just getting new batteries installed and delivered to them. Have you seen that before?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if you're talking about the Neo batteries for the cars.
Yes, I think so. Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was really interesting early on. I actually thought it was a really cool innovation to begin with, but as charging infrastructure has improved and picked up, it's completely redundant already, because you can charge batteries so quickly now that even though it only takes you 4 minutes to switch out a battery in those cars using that system, you can also charge some electric vehicles now. You can get 250 miles of range in 15 minutes, which is not that far off what you would do in a petrol station. So and it's still improving. So I think that technology has kind of become redundant already. The good thing in terms of recycling, though, kind of on that point, is that while those batteries eventually become kind of worthless for using in vehicles because they're so heavy and they, of course, have lost a lot of their kind of capacity over the years. A lot of those are still very suitable for anything that's kind of ground based, where it's just static. So, solar farms and things like that, or people's houses where they may need batteries, could in the future end up just being supplied by old car batteries that take up quite a bit of space, and they're heavy. But if you don't need to move them and you've got lots of space, that doesn't really matter.
Yeah. I can imagine that being a massive problem, the amount of batteries that are going to go through, and they're going to have to be stored and disposed of in a sustainable way. Otherwise, there's going to be big environmental concerns moving forward. Yeah. Okay, so on to the major players in the automobile industry for electric vehicles. Which companies do you like in this space? Which ones do you think are making major inroads? Because I think there's always a lot of focus on Tesla, but it has to be known that there are a lot of other automobile companies making electric cars.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, Tesla goes without saying, I think. And fundamentally, a lot of their strength comes from the fact that they're, manufacturing their own batteries. That really has been something that's given them a big edge on pricing and on capacity, where a lot of the kind of legacy players have been scrambling to try and find someone to provide them with good batteries. I think the South Korean companies are interesting. Hyundai and Kia. South Korea has got a pretty big battery industry of its own. LG Chem and uh, quite a few other kind of Samsung, obviously, companies in that region that build those kind of products. So there's a lot of efficiencies there. And of course, they're much more accepted in the West than China in terms of tariffs. The other option, really, I think, is China. BYD is by far the biggest EV company in the world, bigger than Tesla, which most people don't realize. They sell many, many more vehicles than Tesla do. And they're expanding into Europe and the US very aggressively at the moment, which is part of the reason that tariffs seem to be ramping up on the moving up the agenda in both those regions, because it's putting at risk some of the legacy players like Volkswagen and GM and Ford and the like. But I find Hyundai and BYD are the two companies that kind of stick out to me the most, besides Tesla, of course.
Yeah. I know you used to really like Ford. Is Ford a company that you think are making good inroads into that sector, or have you changed your mind on that?
I think, like most of those companies, they've kind of slowed down a bit more recently, especially because Ford, their biggest market is obviously the US, and US adoption for EVs is much slower than in Europe and in China. So as a result, they've kind of pulled back from that a bit. The market has also just become a lot more competitive. Every major car company has now got several electric models for sale, and most of those are in the same kind of segments of like the kind of crossover to SUV kind of area, or kind of luxury end of the market. So anyone who's kind of early and moving into the small vehicle space, I think, can do well. It doesn't look like Ford is really kind of pushing in that direction at the moment. Tesla, it hasn't even announced any small EVs yet, which is quite surprising. And so really, it's kind of left China and the Korean companies to take that, which I think is why they're some of the kind of more attractive companies, along with the efficiencies in terms of the fact that they have a better supply chain set up as well.
Cost saving advantages. Yeah. Yeah, so I live in Korea and there's lots of electric cars on the roads and there's huge amount of charging stations. So yeah, I can see that they're going to play a big part in the future for electronic cars. And China obviously has a lot of cost saving advantages, a lot of manpower. Yeah. How about the economics for having a electric vehicle versus having a petrol car at the moment. Are the cost savings significant enough for people to switch over? Maybe for the people that are less environmentally minded and want it for pure efficiency purposes.
Yeah, so I think this is interesting for a few reasons. First of all, I think hybrids are playing quite an important role in introducing people to the advantages of an electric car and what it's like to have an electric car. I mean, even just the fact that it's quieter. Obviously, that doesn't play into the economics too much. Economically, hybrids are probably the worst of both worlds. But I think that the thing that's really going to be the big game changer for people is when we move to what I mentioned earlier, which was having your car act as a battery for your house and for everything else, so that you can sell the power from your car back to the grid when it needs it in the middle of the day, potentially while you're at work, and then you can charge it at night for much cheaper rates. You can use it as a backup system for your house if there's a power outage. Ford have implemented that on the F-150 in the US quite well if you have the right charger. So you can do that already. Tesla, likewise, you can do things like that with as well. So I think that will kind of help incentivize people to some extent when they start thinking about their car a bit differently and start seeing it more as a battery on wheels rather than just a car, because that helps you kind of bring back some additional savings if you're using the power from your car wisely for your own consumption in your house and things. The other thing that is that obviously it ties in really well with having your own renewable energy. If you have your own solar panels, then you're not paying anything to charge your car. You've paid for your solar panels. They will pay for themselves more quickly if you have a car to charge, because you can do that when you're not consuming power. Tell it to charge the car whenever there's not enough electricity being used. So I think those two things really will make it much, much, much more efficient to have electric vehicles. Obviously, if you live in an oil petro state, that might not be the case. But I think certainly in Europe, that's what we're starting to see unfold.
Those petro states also have a lot of sun.
They do.
So they are prime candidates, but obviously oil's a lot cheaper, so there's less incentive to switch over. But that will come in time. I think, as you said, it's pretty inevitable that it will happen. It's just there'll be different rates of speed of adoption in different countries as time passes. Yeah. All right. And lastly, I wanted to talk about wind energy and which type of scenarios and what are we using wind energy for in mainly the commercial industry.
So wind is an interesting industry. It's actually one of the most competitive energy markets there is, really. I think wind power, land-based wind power, is incredibly cost competitive compared with other sources of energy. It's better than solar in many ways because of the fact that it doesn't stop during the night, so it's operating during peak hours. There's actually a project of a subsea cable that connects Morocco to the UK that's being built at the moment, and the reason for that is that Morocco's time zone and the time of day that they tend to get strong winds near the Sahara lines up perfectly with the peak hours of the UK. So we will eventually be, using wind from a completely different part of the world to power, the time when everyone's cooking their dinner in in the UK, which is interesting. So yeah, it's very competitive when it's on land in terms of cost. It's pretty good in terms of the installation time as well. So people talk about nuclear a lot as a good sustainable kind of option to reduce our emissions. But the big problem with nuclear is that in most countries it takes 10 years to build a nuclear power plant, whereas wind can be set up in two, or less sometimes. Wind has a bit more of a kind of problem when it's offshore wind. It's very good at producing a lot of wind out there. Unsurprisingly, there's not much in the way, and so certainly around some coastal regions around the UK, for example, that are incredibly windy. Scotland is very well known for producing more than enough power for itself and several of its neighbours. Um, So there's some spots in the world that are incredibly good for installing wind power like that. The problem with wind in the ocean is the maintenance costs and the cost of transporting that power. So you need to build the infrastructure to then move all of that power to where you need it. And when it's out in the middle of the ocean, that's difficult. The advantage to the ocean is that you get bigger wind turbines. If you're building on land, you need to transport the blades, and the bigger the blades, the way it works is the for every like meter of blade that you add, it's like 3 times more efficient, something in that region. And so the problem with building on land is that you can't get blades big enough, because you can't get them to where you need to install them. Whereas in the ocean, you can have really, really big ships take really, really big blades and put them on really, really big wind turbines. So that's the thing that's in their favor. And I think that as time goes on and we continue to see the scale of offshore wind turbines getting bigger, we will see more and more adoption of offshore wind.
Okay. And is the disadvantages of wind energy, is it a lot to do with the inconsistency because you're not always sure how much wind there's going to be at any period of time? So sometimes you could have excess power and sometimes you might have too little power. Is that a massive drawback? And also, I guess the cost of installation is obviously quite expensive to set up these massive wind farms. What's your views on the disadvantages of wind power?
Yeah, so I think that the cost of installation is definitely one of the big ones. And it's so big, in fact, that some of the biggest wind projects in the world have been cancelled over the past couple of years because of inflation, where suddenly inflation interest rates, because suddenly they were just not commercially viable to be completed anymore because the cost was so high. So I think that's definitely one of the biggest challenges. In terms of the intermittency of power, it's really not too bad, because the cool thing is that they use a turbine, right? And you can use a turbine to generate power, or you can use it to capture power. So you can actually kind of run them backwards, essentially, the same as you would do in electric cars to kind of consume power if you're generating too much. So oversupply isn't as big of a problem. It's a bit easier to control a wind turbine than some other things in terms of ramping up and down, and how you control them if the wind is too strong and things like that. So that's not too bad. And I think the issue of undersupply should just be solved by more and more batteries coming online, and the adoption of electric cars, as mentioned earlier. When we start to see people changing their habits of how they're charging their cars, and if they're then using that power to give back to the grid at certain times when it needs it, that should help solve that problem. So I think there's a lot going for wind on that side of things. The real issue is that it's a very fiercely competitive industry, and the cost of installation can be kind of prohibitive.
Okay. All right. And I don't want to leave out uranium and nuclear power, but we don't have a lot of time left. But what are your main views on nuclear power moving forward? And do you think, with a lot of the different plants opening up around the world and the government recently have been a lot more friendly to them opening, do you see a big future for nuclear power? And if you don't, what kind of drawbacks do you see?
I think overall I'm quite neutral on nuclear. Actually, I think we're going to see a lot of adoption in some regions, and declining adoption in other regions. Recently, there's been the trend of large tech companies buying nuclear power plants and bringing them back online again. So, 3 Mile Island, which obviously is one of the more famous ones for having a meltdown, was recently bought by Microsoft, so that they can use it. There's another nuclear power plant in a similar area, actually, in northern USA, I think Pennsylvania, that was bought by Amazon for the same sort of purpose. And that in many ways is kind of driving people to think, okay, maybe we do need more nuclear. If we're getting to a point where these companies are buying these power stations because they need so much power, then maybe we should start building more of them. There's also the whole kind of small modular reactor side of things as well, which could end up being useful in some of the more kind of rural areas that it's hard to develop some of the other renewable technologies. I think there's always going to be a place for nuclear, to be honest. certainly for some time to come. The biggest hurdle for me is the capital costs and the time. It's even more expensive than wind in most cases, and it takes a lot longer than pretty much anything else you could build. So that's the big drawback. China is really the only place that's kind of doing it fast enough for it to be that worthwhile, I think.
Yeah, I'm very pro on nuclear, but I do know that when you're setting up these reactors, you're setting them up for the very long term. You're talking multi-decade projects at the minimum. So I think that's very important. But then I do think the major drawback for me on nuclear is that you are at the beck and call of the governments, right? The government. So if we're talking multi-decade projects, if there was to be another nuclear spill somewhere, they could change their mind, right? Again, and then you could have a cold period in nuclear moving forward. So I guess that's the biggest risk for me on nuclear. I think that all the big companies out there would like to use nuclear power. It's just how quick can they bring that nuclear power, and will the governments be friendly to them, not just this year or next year or in an election cycle, but over multi decades.
Yeah. And I think just a final point to add to that is if you look at what happened in Ukraine around their nuclear power plants, you know, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is the largest in Europe, I think, and it's in a war zone. And then the same with the Chernobyl site, you know, there was fighting around it, and suddenly that I think made a lot of people a lot more conscious about, you know, where these things are located and how they're operated, and thinking more about that long term. If this is going to be here for 40 years, are we really sure that it's in a secure enough location?
Yeah, yeah, they've got to be extremely careful of that, especially in those war zones. Yeah. All right. So, Jay, how can everybody find out more about you as an investor? What social media are you using? How can people reach you?
Yeah, the best place to find me is on eToro. So my name on there is Jaynemesis, and the same is true on Twitter. Jaynemesis is what I'm called there, and that's where I spend far too much of my time. So
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll put the links in the description of the YouTube and Spotify video so people can find out more about you if they want to. So I've really enjoyed the discussion today. I think we went over a number of different areas. I could have talked for a good few more hours with you on different areas, but we'll leave that for a future episode.
yeah, sounds good. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time, Jay, and look forward to chatting with you soon. And I think the audience will get a lot from this podcast.
Thanks.